right, welcome to the Sumer Sports Show Wednesday. We finally get to do a Wednesday again. I'm here. I'm Eric Eager. I'm one of the VPs at Sumer Sports. I'm joined by the CEO of Sumer Sports, Thomas Dimitroff. Thomas, this has been an interesting week. Monday, we got the news that Zach Wilson didn't really want to play for the Jets anymore. Now he's starting. The betting markets have moved a couple points in favor of the Jets this week. We have, the Athletic article about the Carolina Panthers and, the what's going on there. We have uncertainty in Washington. We have, obviously Denver on a little bit of a streak here. Chicago, there was the report that Jim Harbaugh may be the next in line for that head coaching job as he prepares his Michigan Wolverines for the college football playoff. So there's so much going on, Thomas. How you doing?
'Tis the season, right? I mean, on all these levels. We talk about NCAA, talking about a lot of heated people out there, right? Florida State related, et cetera, et cetera. And then we start thinking closer to home on the pro side, always getting calls on the phone from people that are tied into different places, as you are, as Sean Clement is, and other people, Chase Fallavine in our business. There's a lot of scuttlebutt out there, right? I have to be careful that I don't dive too far into that, because when I was in that mode, I would always are you kidding me? Keep your nose out of that, right? Now that I'm kind of outside of it a little bit, and you've brought me into the media side of things, it's a little tough for me to stay out of it, because you want to be on top of things, right? But how much of it is a bunch of bull crap? How much are there rumors? How much is real in some of these rumors? It's worth talking about some of these teams that you just brought up. Legit.
Yeah. For sure. And I think, you have to toe a finer line than, somebody like me or somebody who's even more traditional media, just because, there's a lot of editorialization of some of these things. I was on the phone yesterday with somebody in the league, just kind of talking through it. And it's the same as you, Thomas. I got a message today that was like, what about these teams? What about tell me all the GM openings you think are going to happen. Tell me all the head coach. And obviously you have a little bit of nervousness there, because you don't want to editorialize, people's livelihoods and stuff. Right. And you don't want, there are situations, and we deal with them in our business too, where it's performance matters and you need to evaluate. But at the same time, these are people who have real lives and real families to go home to. And there's even the aspect of there's a lot more to it than just the win-loss record, but we do have to evaluate these things, just because football is kind of a merit-based situation, and we want to make sure that we're not also giving people bad information. I do want to start with the Carolina, the Carolina story that came out from the Athletic today, which sort of chronicled a little bit of what's going on in that building, and sort of they talked about it. They framed it as kind of like a Hunger Games situation. I'm always conditioned to believe that when you look at a piece of media, or you look at an outcome of a game, I'm always conditioned to believe it's never as bad as it seems, and it's never as good as it seems, right? You have, for years, you had my friend Jordan Rodriguez would write about the Rams, and it would always be glowing, right? It'd always be oh, look at this new brilliant thing that Les Snead figured out. And it's okay, I do think Les Snead's quite good, but there are downsides that they're leaving out of the article. I think when you look at Carolina, it obviously paints a really rough picture. Oh, who the heck would want to go to Carolina? All this kind of stuff. I want to think that this thing can be turned around, though. And I think that there are some components there, namely the fact that they drafted a quarterback first overall. And, we saw what happened with Trevor Lawrence just 2 years ago when he was struggling under Urban Meyer. And now things, although the injury happened Monday, wasn't the greatest. These things can turn around quite quickly. And so I think people believe that Carolina is they're down in the dumps forever and ever. Amen. And I just don't believe that.
Don't believe that at all. You can resurrect a team with the right people in the right place, regime wise, as long as everyone's communicating properly. The owner's got to be very, very direct about what he wants, back to a conversation we had, what his values are, what he's expecting from the GM, what he's expecting from the head coach, what the GM and the head coach are expecting from the coordinators, what they're expecting for all the other departments in the organization, right? I'm talking about all the way across from cap and contracts to athletic performance. there are so many departments in an organization, as everyone would know, just on the football operations side, not to mention the business side, right? Which is a whole other world in of itself. When I read that article and someone said to me, like, oh, you got to read this article, look at this. This is one of the worst articles. It's unbelievable, unfathomable. And I'm like, okay. I started reading it. I'm like, it's not that blown out of proportion, meaning people are always doing those things. Hunger Games, okay, maybe that's who penned the article, by the way, very quickly. Diana, who was
Rossini?
Rossini.
Yeah.
And anyway, my point is that happens in good times and bad times. I'm talking about people are always jockeying. It's an organization. There will always be political elements to it. Honestly, what you do with that is how the main organization, how the main leaders handle it, how they diffuse it, to me is what allows a team to work through the distractions of something like this and stay on the positive side, whether in a really tough situation like Carolina now, or whether they're with a team that is, let's say like the Buffalo Bills, who is a good football team, but they're running some ups and downs, right? How they're dealing with some. They have their own internal stuff that they're dealing with. They're getting people at the water cooler. There's no question that happens everywhere. This isn't just the Carolina Panthers. And it is being blown out of proportion. People want to jump on. My last point on this is take a deep breath, Scott Fitterer, which I know he's doing. And Scott is a really good person, and he's going to communicate as well as he can with that group. But the people that are talking about, the people within that organization, Eric, who are calling out to people and texting people, I would never come here. This is a mess. I mean, you need to find those people in your organization and make sure they are taken care of one way or another. And I don't mean to be sounding like a heavy there, but that's the last thing David Tepper and co need in that organization moving forward. They need people that are going to be on board. And of course, there are a lot of people probably aren't on board right now because it's so precarious at this point.
Well, yeah, you had the Aaron Rodgers interview with Pat McAfee where he was talking about how he was disappointed in the leaks that came out of the Jets building. And I'm assuming, a similar idea when you're talking about Carolina and some of the things that are said in that building. Fitterer, since being the GM, Thomas, a record of 13-33. So it's been rough for them, but I do want to, and I do want to, take it back here. Like when you joined the Falcons in 2008, right? The 2007 Falcons, you're talking about a 4-win team, 2 coaches, right? Bobby Petrino leaves the whole thing in a cloud of dust. There's, obviously there were some good assistants there, Mike Zimmer and Hugh Jackson and so forth, but you're kind of starting from scratch. The 3 quarterbacks there were Joey Harrington, Chris Redmond, and Byron Leftwich. They had an end of career Warwick Dunn. You did have a useful guy in Roddy White, but even an end of career Algie Crumpler on that team. Like, I'm sorry, but you got that team to 10-6 in year 1, even though the guys I'm listing, I think you look at Carolina and people are like, oh, there's nothing to work with here. Well, there wasn't a ton to work with in Atlanta when you first got there, and you're able to buy, somebody Mass, one of our great listeners here said, what's great about the NFL is it takes one off season to turn things around. I think that diminishes a little bit of course, of the fortune you have to turn it around. And the difference between your Falcons in 2008 and these Panthers is you had the 3rd pick. This team already took a quarterback, and you've gotten to see him in 1 year. But I still think I still think they're not that far away. No team is that far away, right? We're talking, you and I were in the office recently, and we're talking about Tampa Bay, Atlanta playing for first place in that division at 6-7 should the Bucs win that game. And so I just think, look, it's doom and gloom, but the NFL is so cyclical that I would not be surprised if, whether it's Scott, whether it's Scott leading the ship or somebody else, somebody coming in there and making the Panthers a viable franchise relatively soon, even if, things are not necessarily great there. Sean had a good point here, and I do want to get your opinion on this. Where's this rumor? I don't know if everybody believes this, but the Rams did offer 2 first-round picks to the Panthers for Brian Burns last year. I do think not accepting that trade is obviously looming large, and a good omen on like a question that I've asked you a bunch on this show, where it's like, how do you know when to say when as a team as well, right? So this team very clearly has acted quickly this year in saying, this season's not going to amount to much. Let's move on from the coach. Let's build for the future. Last year, they were a little bit less that way and not giving up on Brian Burns. But Brian Burns has not signed an extension with this team. He's driven a hard bargain from what I can tell in the media. And so, like, again, some of that's bad luck. Some of that is kind of mistiming the market and stuff. But this Panthers team, there's going to be opportunities that come up for them. And hopefully they can take advantage of them because, like I said, I think that there's an opportunity, for every NFL team, including them, to improve drastically during a course of just one off season.
So my take before we move on to the next team that I know you want to hit a number of these before. So Scott Fitterer, I think the number was about 28% to this point, right? Win rate, is that what I think? It's 28%, whatever you had said. It's
28.3% win rate.
So 28%. And I believe, I understand those are tough things. Owners are looking at that data now. There's no question about it. As I understand, Scott and David Tepper get along really well. David has a lot of respect for Scott as a football man. Of course, we all make mistakes as general managers, meaning like not all your moves are going to work. We had some good fortune in that first few years with Mike Smith. I mean, as you know, Mike was a coach of the year 3 times out of 5 years. That's a big deal. We picked the right person as a coach during that stint. And I will maintain that Mike was one of the better coaches that never got an opportunity to be a third, or have a second chance. Back to Scott. I mean, yes, there's a way to recover out of all this. The big thing is, how are they going to go about the search process? This is my feeling. How is David Tepper, Scott Fitterer, and whoever that group is, how are they going to go about searching out the next best coach? It can't just be, in my humble opinion, it can't just be who's a hot commodity. Oh, there's talk about Ben Johnson. I mean, there's a lot to talk about Ben Johnson. Of course, he's talented. Is Ben Johnson going to lead that team? Would Ben Johnson lead the team the way that David Tepper wants him to lead? Okay, I know they're saying, well, he wants him to do the best with a quarterback that they spent a lot on, of course, and made a big-time move. Believe me, I know all about making big-time moves when there's a lot of scrutiny around it. These are the kind of things that they have to really sit down. That this coaching deal is the number one move that they need to get right now, and they need the right search process in it. They can't just go and find out from the Detroit Lions that they like this guy. Oh yeah, he's pretty special. Shake his hand, he looks you in the eye. It's not that anymore. It's even, not that.
I mean, you look at their last search. Like I have friends who used to work for the Colts. I have friends who would speak up and down about Frank Reich, and like Frank Reich is always looking at our numbers. By the way, promo, anybody listening, by the way, agent side, team side, we have, this is something that we work on at Sumer. If you want counsel from us, we are available. But like, here's the thing. Frank Reich in 2021 was, in our metrics, the 9th best coach in the NFL. 2022 was 3rd worst. And I think a lot of people, myself included, when they hired him, I was bullish because everybody speaks about Frank Reich, terrific guy, amazing, obviously treated Jim Kelly, incredibly well as his backup. Like, there's so much to like, but obviously the numbers matter. And, I think that was one thing where you get nervous about a guy like Reich because, he had terrific coaching metrics for years in Indianapolis, and one year it fell off. I think the Panthers looked at those first bunch of years and were like, this is going to be what our new coach is going to be. We're getting value here. And we've seen a number of times. Chip Kelly was terrific early in Philadelphia. It fell off a little bit. The Niners buy the dip and it doesn't work out. Like, we've seen this a number of times with coaches. And I just think, again, this is not something where we have the silver bullet, but there's a lot of data that can contextualize these answers. For example, if you look at Detroit, like, you can make a very good argument that Ben Johnson, did a better job in 2022 than he's done in 2023. And like, they're still very good offensively, but again, these are things that you want to have those indicators. And, whereas you look somewhere like Baltimore with Mike McDonald, and that's a guy who has increased every single year as far as his efficacy as a defensive coordinator. So, how do you weigh those two things? I think Johnson's going to get a head coaching job. But again, it's like one of those where one-year coordinators, you really got to be a little bit worried because there's not that much data on them, and they're all contextual. They're all, when you make Jared Goff look like a great player one year and then he's kind of regresses to a good player the next year, like who gets blamed, who gets credit for that? It's a really hard problem.
Well, look, I mean, the last thing on Carolina, again, how important this coaching hire is. The process that they go through is wildly important. Get the right people around you. Again, respectfully, Mr. Tepper and Scott, make sure that you have the right people around you. They're going to help you with the process. And here's my thought. It's not just a quarterback guru that comes in, a sensible quarterback guru, right? You could easily have a really thoughtful and presence-laden kind of or presence element to a coach that comes in there and leads like that organization needs, and have the right coordinator to help out. It doesn't necessarily need to be the head coach. That's my feeling. That's why I think it opens up a lot more opportunity. And when you do think about some of these defensive coaches who are really prime leaders of men, have morale to them, understand football, have an understanding of all positions, that's a big deal for me versus, and that's my, what if Bill Belichick hypothetically is not him knocking on the door, but what if it comes down to something like that where David Tepper has to make a decision between Ben Johnson and Bill Belichick? To me, that's a no-brainer. No offense to Ben, but that's a no-brainer.
Yeah, no, I mean, yes. And there's, the Belichick thing, like everybody's talking about how New England's 2-10. Like Andy Reid's last year in Philadelphia, the Eagles were 4-12. Like every coach has a year like this. And I think that a change of scenery in some cases could be better. You look at this team, this Panthers team. Now I'm looking at Over the Cap, our one of our partners, Jason Fitzgerald is terrific here. This is the 2024 cap table for them. When you look at this, there's not a ton of high price players, which is good. There's not a ton of dead money on the cap either, about 1.02 million in that. Moton, that's a big contract, and that's you worry a little bit about that. There's some bonus proration in there as well. He's carrying a big number, but there's not a lot of guys on this team, Thomas, that are carrying big numbers, which I think means obviously if you come in, you have to be intentional, in my opinion, about offensive line, about weapons. It's all about it. Sean's one of our great listeners here too. How closely should this new coach be tethered to Bryce Young? Are you pot committed? You are pot committed. You traded $200 million in assets to move up and get him. He's never going to be more valuable to another team than he is your team. And yeah, the entire airplane of this new coaching staff needs to be built around getting Bryce Young in his slender, small frame, everything he needs to be successful. That has to be your number one goal. And that was when you had Matt, right? Like you went out and got Michael Turner. You went out and, eventually got Julio Jones. You went and got Tony Gonzalez. Like the whole airplane has to be built around the quarterback being successful for your team.
There's, again, so last year when Sean Payton was looking for a home, right? He was coming back, looking at New Orleans. Would they take him back? There was nothing secure. I mean, I had heard stories about him, and the interest at Carolina, but he was looking for a lot of money, 18 plus, right? The reality is a guy like Bill Belichick or established coaches versus Ben Johnson, who could come in probably at $6 or $7 million a year. It's going to be very different than what a guy who has a lot of established ability to him. And look, these are big numbers for the coaches on the other end of this, right? These are upward of $20 million contracts a year, and they're going to be a legit commitment. As an organization, you have to believe in how important the head coach, and I'm raising my hand here, it is hugely important. And I still haven't determined over all of my years if it's a quarterback or if it's a head coach, because they're both wildly important. But with any given year, it feels like there's a little bit of an edge on either the position, the quarterback, or the head coach. And this organization needs to understand that. Bryce Young has a long, long way to go at a lot of levels. So they need to train him along. But here's the interesting thing, inside that organization, who was really pushing it, and if it was everyone, it doesn't really matter now, but it's meaning they have him there. What's the best way to get him in the best spot, right? When you read some of that article and they're talking about, there's all kinds of reports inside there around, Frank's back. And I hate saying that because that's what people do. Owners are going to ask his experts in the building what's wrong here. And he's going to get that information, and he's going to synthesize and internalize, chew on it, and then he's going to go back to the head coach and say, why don't we get him moving more in the pocket? Why don't we get him RPO? Whatever it may be. That's not heresy. That's just what happens. That's what an owner is. He can do that.
Well, and also, this is the part that pisses me off a little bit about this whole, and again, and the other person that wrote the article, by the way, I want to give them their credit, is Joseph Person. So it's Joseph Person and Diana Rossini.
Yep.
The owner can do that stuff. They own the team.
Yeah.
Now, like this whole idea that like it's somehow immoral for the owner to have like input on stuff, right? Now, is it the smartest thing? Maybe not. Is it like the story about them wanting to run the 3-4 because he's a Steelers guy and a Pittsburgh guy and they always run the 3-4? I know that we'll laugh at that or whatever, but like, I don't know. If I was watching the Steelers operate for 3 decades and watching how they win consistently and they never bottom out, like, wouldn't that be to me, it doesn't seem all that asinine to be like, hey, whatever they're doing in Pittsburgh, let's at least try some of these things. And I know that gets blown out of proportion, but it's his team. He put up the $1 billion for the team.
And
like,
yes, I'm sorry.
And it's his train set.
It's his train set. But think about this. This is so true. 40 years ago, no, this is my world. You hired me, keys to the kingdom. It's not that way anymore. There are some longstanding people like Bill Belichick and some of the coaches like that, Andy Reid, Pete Carroll, who wouldn't have it. Sean Payton, maybe. The next wave are so much more understanding of this. And they're going to listen to a very smart owner, even though that owner might not have a lot of background. It is. He's spent a lot of money and been successful in a lot of other areas, right? If they bring something up, it's up to a head coach and a GM to listen, take it back. Quite honestly, you go back in your room with a head coach and a GM and you ruminate on it. If you think it's a full of crap idea, then you tactfully deliver that back to your owner. I don't like the idea. You don't say it's a full of crap idea, but it is worth your while to talk about it, because I will raise my hand here. Arthur Blank, yes, he was down on the sideline, and I never had an issue with that. None of our head coaches did. He has a presence. Arthur Blank was outrageously mindful of his football people. And I feel very blessed to be around that, where there are other owners out there that aren't as tactful as what you were alluding to. Yes, it is train set. I just think there's a nice fine line of being tactful with it so that you're not feeling like your group is saying, I don't have say in this, right?
But ultimately, like, and I agree. And I think like what we don't want, obviously, is to, for lack of a better term, emasculate the people that we've put in positions to, like, both of us manage people. Like, one thing I prize is giving people freedom and allowing them to work, but they also have to earn that. And if I'm David Tepper, like, and again, I'm not excusing any of this, I'm just trying to explain it. If I'm David Tepper and you're 13-33 the last 46 games, I'm going to be less likely to be like, oh yeah, you got that. Like, I get what they're doing. Like, I mean, I'm guessing, right? And Arthur's a different owner, but like, I'm guessing Arthur Blank had input into what you were doing. I'm guessing that input was less fierce and less there was less volume of that when you were going 13-3 and winning the NFC South and making the NFC Championship game. And like that, my thing is like, he bought the team. He's entrusted people with $1 million worth of salaries to build this thing, and it's not working. What do you expect him to do? It's kind of my
his job, Eric, and I'll speak from Arthur's standpoint. I remember him saying this to us. Look, my job is not to like you said, emasculate, but his job, he always felt that his job was to bring up ideas, whether they were right or whether they were wrong, for us to chew on them, ruminate, ideate, whatever we want to call it, at different levels, and then come back to him with an educated decision on why we wouldn't or would do what was suggested, whether it was by him, whether it was by Rich McKay, whether it was by me, Smitty, Dan Quinn, or even our coordinators, right? That was part of it. Most of these guys, that's what we do believe. It doesn't mean that this is just, a decision by what's the line? Just, it's not.
It's not a dictatorship, right?
No,
I mean, and it could be, right? Like, this is the thing. there's nothing that says it can't be a dictatorship. It's just, it's not. It's not as bad as it sounds, is what I'm saying. And to, the reason that this league is, I want to be very careful here. The reason that this league has grown in value, the reason that this league is the most entertaining entertainment business in the entire world, the reason why NBC Sunday Night Football is the most watched television, because there are people who invest in this league, and far be it from me to say that guy doesn't get a say in this billion-dollar investment he's made, billions of dollar investment he's made. And it takes, and again, if people in the league want more autonomy, they got to win football games, is my point, right? Okay. And
yeah, that's right. And look, man, we could talk about this forever, and I get passionate about it because, again, there is a fine line. Again, train set, yes. Opinions, yes. 100%. Press your people, yes. Take an example like what I said Arthur Blank was. He let us do our things. We'll never say anything but that. Take a guy like Clark Hunt, one of the best owners to work for. Clark, and I remember talking to Beach about this, and he's saying to me, look, we'll bring up opportunities to talk about leadership and leading the team, and he'll have ideas about different things. That's a mutual respect for a very established family and owner. And they do great things there because he's very tactful with how he approaches something that could be, it's never easy. So I just want to say, looking at those owners out there that are mindful as they grow, even Arthur, like in those early 2 or 3 years or 4 years after Home Depot, very different owner, respectfully to say, than he is now 20 plus years, right? Yep. He has a completely different understanding of it. Mr. Tepper, where is David right now? What year is he in? 4? I think it's 4.
2018. So year 5.
Yeah. So he's still growing with this system. Of course, massive success in the finance world and incredibly intelligent. We listen to Paul Tudor Jones talk about him. He's like, that guy is outrageously intelligent and adept at what he does. Yep. This is as an investor, right? These are two tycoons.
I can guarantee you that if the Panthers started having success, we'd hear less of these stories. And that doesn't mean that David Tepper's changed as a person. It just means that success. You talk about Kansas City, if the Kansas City Chiefs win this weekend, it will be their 11th straight winning season, right? So the fact that Clark Hunt is easier to work with is probably a function of the fact that they win. And things are, and the same thing's true, of course, in our business at Sumer. Things are true. And this is a good segue because I know that we don't have a ton of time today just because of random things, but similar idea. Josh Harris, buys the Washington Commanders. The Commanders were the team that he was a fan of when he was a kid and growing up, and still a fan of course. And you have, that situation where, other than Jack Del Rio, who they let go recently because the defense has been, and they traded Montez Sweat and Chase Young. So they're certainly moving towards the future. We still have Martin Mayhew as the general manager there. Martin Mayhew in his career is 66-108-1. He's 19-27-1 in Washington. Washington has been.
Do you have a percentage there or not?
Let me do the division
as we start talking about.
So he's at 40. They're at 41% since he's been in Washington, win percentage wise. Okay. And so that's not as bad as 28%. I did want to bring this up, by the way. Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch in their first 2 years with San Francisco were 10-22. That was a 31% win percentage. So these things can come from the miry clay, so to speak, and become successful. I think with Mayhew, you have kind of more years, obviously. You have more of a track record of kind of the same thing, which is kind of they finish in that 7 to 8 wins kind of every year sort of deal. Obviously, Rivera is on, he's coaching. I believe this is year 4 for him in Washington. They have a bridge quarterback in Sam Howell, your guy from UNC. There's a lot of kind of when I watch this Washington team, I see kind of a team that's a little bit in a holding pattern. I see, they haven't cleaned house yet. They haven't necessarily implemented a lot of the stuff that Josh Harris, who's famously, with the 76ers, brought in Daryl Morey, with the New Jersey Devils has done some, analytically sound things. For example, their assistant GM is a woman who's, very analytically sound. That hasn't happened in Washington yet. That doesn't mean it won't, but they're sort of slow playing this thing. What's your read on the Commanders and kind of this new era of Josh Harris's ownership?
Well, this is tough. I mean, under 50% is tough as a regime, especially when you come in as a new organization. And Josh Harris has been around professional organizations and understands at a level. Of course, he's getting to know football more and more. Of course, he's always watched the Redskins. Gosh, it was a Redskins at one time. Yes,
he was. Yeah, that was the name of the team when he was a fan.
Back in the day. He's got football people in there. I mean, Martin Mayhew has been a GM before. He's one of the very few fortunate ones that have gotten the second chance, right? Yeah. The second
Martin
chance.
Mayhew, by the way, this is how down that franchise has been. Martin Mayhew was starting cornerback opposite Darryl Green the last time they won the Super Bowl.
While we're talking here and I go on my little diatribe, look up Martin Mayhew's success or his percentage at Detroit and then getting a second chance, because he was at Detroit as a GM for how many years? 3 or 4, I think.
No, he was part of the regime he was part of the regime with Matt Millen, and then he took over for Matt Millen. He was 47-81 as the GM of the Detroit Lions. So
when he was there,
32%.
So 32% and 40%. Those are numbers that have people, when you're a new owner coming in, you're looking at that, right? You're looking at not just the percentage, but you're looking at success. You're looking at building. Martin is a smart guy with background as a football person, playing in the league as well, long time, diligent, really, good person and all that. And yet new owners are looking for wins. You get guys like Magic Johnson who are outspoken about what they're doing there. What do? They fire Jack Del Rio. That organization's coming in right now, and I'm sure there are a lot of consultants working for him behind the scenes right now. Where are we with this regime? What's the next step here? How are we truly going to build this? Are we going to maintain with our group, or are we going to completely change things? This is something that will be determined very soon. But you're right. There's not been a whole bunch of talk about that, right?
Yeah, they hired Eugene Shen, who's a friend of mine who used to be one of the analytics people for the Ravens, Dolphins, and Jaguars. He's in that VP role there. That's a positive sign. Eugene's a very smart guy who's in finance before, has football experience. But, it's interesting, right? Because obviously no GM, right? The question has to be like, when you, like, let's assume, Martin, for whatever reason isn't retained, right? And then like you bring a GM in, that person's got to mesh with kind of every person in the business, VP level, assistant GM level, chief of staff level, coach, right? So like, I understand for example, when Daryl Morey took over Houston, he didn't, clean house right away either, right? So I understand like the slow playing of it. And I understand like, he had a great quote where he said like, we can get to 8 or 9 wins very quickly. We can't build a sustainable champion all that fast, right? So I sort of like in some ways the humaneness of going in and kind of, smoothing the thing out as you kind of build the staff. But there's an element of, that general manager that comes in, to the point of what we just talked about with Carolina. That general manager has to come in with enough power to have say over the direction of the club. And I do fear sometimes when you kind of create the thing in a piecemeal way, right? In Carolina, it was Matt Rule was hired, and they threw the absolute bag at him because the Giants wanted him and he was a hot commodity in college football. That the Fitterer signing a year later was more of like it was viewed at the time as kind of a subordinate to the Rule hire. And that's where I get worried. And maybe you can expound on this, because you were hired with Mike together, but then you also had a situation where you hired a coach, after Mike left. Like I worry sometimes. Like I understand the humanity of wanting to sort of slowly hire people, but I also wonder sometimes, does that create a mismatch from a power dynamic standpoint that can be hard to overcome when it comes to like who's in charge, right? You bring somebody in while existing people are there, and people are wondering about who gets to make these decisions. And in football, it's about making good, sound decisions. And the question is like, how does that hierarchy go when you kind of slow play the whole process?
Well, let me just say, so Martin Mayhew comes in with Ron Rivera, right? They're both longtime football people. Martin did a really good job around him, right? I have a great deal of respect for Chris Polian, Bill Polian's son, who was a GM at Indianapolis. Obviously, unfortunately, that didn't last as long as it probably could have or should have in another city, another organization. My point is, your GM is very important that you have the right people around you so that you can really focus on your relationship with the head coach. I believe that deeply, right? You can't think that you're a GM coming in to be chief cook and bottle washer everywhere, right? You can't. I want to say this so I don't forget this as well. Martin Mayhew, one of the very few GMs in modern time, get an opportunity for a second chance. There's also down the street in Jacksonville, Trent Baalke getting another chance. Make no mistake about this. GMs, whether they're formers, fired formers, or whatever they are hoping that the second chance GMs do a good job so that opens back up. They don't want them to fail. Trent is doing a heck of a job down there, and he weathered a storm that most people can't. I mean, that's a tough-ass gentleman who has weathered through a lot, and I have a great deal of respect for how he took that on. Martin got a situation here that's not been the easiest situation, right? Dealing with the owner. There's a lot there. Just know that even though we look at percentages and win percentages, because that's what owners do, as you and I know, there are a lot of layers to why some of those wins happened and why some of them didn't, right? And why some of the losses did. There could be egregious losses that are attached to a general manager, and they really, that general manager had obviously nothing to do with them, but ultimately you're in charge of that, right? So in the end, we can move on from Washington, but it's just going to be interesting to see how all of this plays out, especially back to the firing of a D coordinator in the middle of the season. What's the next step on this?
Yeah, for sure. And I think, and Baalke is, I say this like, it's sort of similar to you in the sense of like the longer you've been out, the more people, and living in Atlanta, I see this as well, as like Baalke had a good record, right? And even though people can like throw stones at somebody, there's an element of, okay, he won, right? And I think like similarly, like obviously when you got fired from the Falcons, like there were a lot of darts thrown at you. And then like over the course of the last few years, you're like, wait a sec, this guy actually won, right? And now like and I think that when you look at former executives in the NFL, I think I hope that becomes more of a thing, right? Where it's like the hot, young, evaluator, analytics person, whatever, they get the job versus somebody who, frankly, like Trent, who was when he was in San Francisco, they won games, right? And and there's an element of being able to, even though it's not the sexiest thing in the world, and maybe, winning football games is part of the job. And like, I think that, I would imagine, the frustration from a former GM who won football games like you did would be that is often overlooked when people are sort of going through the process of hiring. It's like, if you want actually to win football games, here's somebody who at least had the formula back in the day and could apply it to your team now. And you're seeing in Jacksonville, it's not a perfect rebuild. Like I think a lot of people would say, you should have taken Aiden Hutchinson, but for the most part, that team from the Aluakon signing to what they've built around Trevor Lawrence has done a pretty good job. And that's why they're winning football games.
Speaking of not definitely perfect builds and complications, you can bring up Denver. You can bring up, George Payton and where he is and how he's had to be steadfast through this last year. It's not been easy, I'm sure. I can only imagine you get a guy like Sean Payton coming in who is very, very strong and strong ideals. And he had a 5-game winning streak right before this most recent loss. I mean, George is in a spot, again, I've said many, many times, really, really good football man. And everyone probably gets sick and tired of me being so supportive of the guys, but I know these guys and I know they know what they're doing. There is so much playing into decision-making and how things work, right? Some of my best friends who haven't worked out as general managers know that they are really good at what they're doing as far as evaluating talent and interacting and knowing football. But for some reason, their choices, their decision-making on big decisions, and that's what I say, brother, you look back at general managers that they're really cut it down to the most important decisions that they made in their tenure. That's how they're going to be judged. Right or wrong, it is. They're not going to be judged by how they hit on a 5th rounder or a 6th or 7th rounder. That's not what they're going to be judged about. They're going to be judged on quarterbacks, coaches, big-time trades, acquisitions, contracts, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at Right. Like when you look at, like, for example, and we'll talk about Peyton in a second, but like John Schneider, in Seattle, marred by the Jamal Adams trade, buoyed back up by the Russell Wilson trade, right? To your point about the big moves are really how we judge these guys. Now with Peyton, right? Peyton was in Minnesota. The big move there was getting Kirk Cousins. Kirk has been okay, but for the most part, that was probably too much of an overspend for that team to be successful. He goes to Denver. And I'm writing an article about this because it's funny. It's about, since they let Osweiler go to Houston, which was the right move, talking about Simeon, Paxton Lynch, Russell Wilson. They finally get to Russell Wilson, right? And it's like, okay, we finally solved the quarterback position, and Russ gets over, and he's a lemon at first, right? And now you're George Payton, poor guy. He's like, I finally did what everybody here wanted, and it didn't work. And now everybody's looking at him like, oh, this isn't, he's not long for this job or whatever. But I wonder how many general managers would have made that trade last year, and how now he's sort of like they're luckily they're now winning, and they might even make the playoffs in the AFC. But like now he's being judged by that move. To your point, like everybody would have made that move given Denver's history at the quarterback position after Peyton Manning in 2015. So it's weird. I think if the Broncos continue to move forward here, I think you're still going to see Peyton. Peyton's got a big decision to make about what to do with Wilson's contract now. It's not going to be great, and I fear for him sometimes because, as we talked about on the show, if you get rid of Russ, it's going to be like a ton of dead money for the next 2 years. And so if your team, if Sean Payton, the highly paid coach, can't get that roster and get them to a level of playoff, it may be George Payton that ends up dealing with the consequences of that, even though they've trusted the big money guy, Sean Payton, to correct some of these things.
What's George's record over the 3 years so far?
So 18 and 28. So that's about. So let me just do this. That's 39%.
Okay, so George, and he comes in, and now he has Sean Payton coming in, who's the decision maker there, right? He's the guy that we say has 53. Ultimately, he wasn't going to come in there just like any of these power coaches. They're not coming in to relinquish or give away 53, right? That's an important thing. So, now you have a situation where Sean Payton is, really going to determine the future of a quarterback who's almost at $250 million, and directly and indirectly, and I say this respectfully to George Payton, what the next steps are going to be with his relationship with the general manager in that organization, right? Because by all rights, he could go to an owner or Greg Penner and say, look, this is how I want it to go, be going forward. This is how I want my partnership to be with the GM going forward. It very well may be with George, or it may be another situation, and that's something that will play out the way it plays out. But will it, in the end, have everything to do with Russell Wilson? This is where George's move with Russell is a huge move. I know my huge move with Julio wasn't a quarterback, but it was a massive move. So some of these big moves that we all make, there's got to be another side to it, right? Whether the trade or the move, was really successful, or like you said with John Schneider, there's a follow-up move that overshadows, right? For instance, there was all kinds of darts starting to be thrown out in San Francisco prior to Brock Purdy coming in this year. Can he do it? They did what they did with a quarterback that they moved up, and et cetera, et cetera. And people were throwing all kinds. Now they've forgotten about that.
Yeah, no one's talking about how Trey Lance and how much of a schmuck they are for trading for him. And honestly, good, because I don't know, if Julio Jones wouldn't have worked out, right? Let's assume that that's the case. You would have still made that move. It wasn't necessarily you know what I'm saying? You can call me crazy. I don't fault the 49ers for trading up for Trey Lance for a second, right? Yeah. Because if he hits and he becomes the quarterback that then your offense depends less on the tight end when he gets hurt. It depends less on the fullback when he gets hurt. Now, everybody's like, oh my God, they could have just gotten a quarterback like Brock Purdy. But Brock Purdy, you remember what happened when Deebo Samuel missed games? When Trent Williams missed games? They lost all 3 of those games, or they lost 3 games in a row. When when you take a step back, and this is why it's so fun for me to work with you and obviously just to talk through things, it's like when you understand the reason why these guys make decisions that they make, I become a lot less Twitterish and a lot less like these guys are idiots. It's like, no, like they made the move for Trey Lance because 2 years ago they saw the best quarterback in the whole game come back from 10 points from behind and do and they wanted some of that, right? And this Niners team still hasn't won a game when they trail by multiple scores in the fourth quarter for the whole Shanahan era, I believe. I have to verify that, but there's still the problems still remain. They're just really good at patching them up, right? And you look at Seattle, the Jamal Adams stuff, he still can't cover anybody, right? But you got all those picks for Russell Wilson, and guess what? It doesn't matter as much. So like it's sort of about how the moves that you make to make up for the moves that don't work that are part of this deal. And for whether it's the ownership or whether it's George Payton, but like bringing Sean Payton in makes up quite a bit for the Russell Wilson trade, which we all would have made in that time, I think. So it's all about the secondary moves you make too.
Secondary, I know we're coming close, but let's finish off. Like we said, we were with Chicago. It's been up and down, sort of nebulous this year, but it's kind of quieted a little bit, right? Where Ryan Poles is, right? Ryan has been there. This is his second year. Is that right?
Yeah, Poles and Eberflus together are 7-22 as the regime. So that's 24%. It's gotten better. Obviously, they won a game in Minnesota a couple weeks ago on Monday night. Justin Fields looks okay. They've kind of pushed off that decision a little bit into obviously making that trade. But I look at the improvements of that defense. I look at the improvements of Fields to an extent. I look at DJ Moore. DJ Moore has 1,000 yards already for this team. Even though it hasn't been great, and everybody's talking about Jim Harbaugh and everybody's talking about Kevin Warren and all this kind of stuff, I would be disappointed if I were Poles or Eberflus and people decided to pull the plug. I would be disappointed because I do see the arrow pointing up. It's slight, but I do see the arrow pointing up for them, and I really wish they could at least see through another season of this.
So you mentioned the name. Kevin Warren is in a really interesting spot. How is he going to come in? He has an obligation to the family. I'm talking about the McCaskies, right? What to do in this organization right now. He's been tracking all of this, as you can imagine. I'm talking about the coaching situation, some of the, the morale, the up and down mercurial elements to that organization. Ryan's tried to stay, here. He's got, Eberflus, he's doing his thing, right? Trying to coach it up the way that they can. They've made some good moves along the way. They're still struggling at certain levels. Will they do anything? What will they do in their quarterback situation? Do you think right now, can you pull up before we move on? What's the quarterback situation on Fields? Where does he land in the Sumer?
Yeah, so if you go to sumersports.com and hit players, I'll just show you guys that for a second here on the screen because we have a really awesome website at Sumer Sports, as Thomas is talking about here. You go to quarterbacks, sort by expected points added. Justin Fields is 23rd in the NFL, just right behind Will Levis in terms of total EPA. If you do EPA by play, he is a little bit better at 22. Mostly pretty solid running the football. If you look at rush EPA, how much he's generated there, he's in the top 11 in football. Not as much as last year rushing and stuff like that. But again, this is a 1,200-yard rusher last year that now is kind of in that 400 range. And I know he missed some time with injuries. This is one where, as hard as it is for me, Thomas, I would probably move on from him if Carolina got the first pick and that was my draft pick. I would probably move on from him, but I don't think he's irredeemable either, which is a very hard spot to be in, right? Not that many people get the definitive nature of the quarterback position, and the Bears don't have that.
So think about this. Back to Kevin Warren. Everyone keep that name on your mind when you're watching what happens here. He's got a situation to go to Ryan Poles and a head coach, a GM and a head coach, how important their relationship is. Can you imagine, and this happens, President Kevin Warren goes to Ryan, what is your suggestion? Where are we? And while Ryan is still trying to keep the right relationship with the head coach, because in our league, it's imperative that you're working together, and it's really uncertain, right? Because you have a president that's in your ear and or an ownership. What do we do with our head coach? You don't know as a GM whether you're staying or going along with the head coach, right? I was part of both. With Mike Smith, I stayed. With Dan Quinn, I was fired at the same time. And I've had conversations with Arthur Blank about it. And his point to me was the two of you were linked at the hip, and that's how you were going to go out, right or wrong. And so it's just going to be, put yourself in that spot as a general manager where you're having to make tough decisions, and you're just not sure exactly how that's going to roll, right? All of a sudden, you're trying to save, and it's not even about saving yourself, but you run into that spot, right? It's not about self-survival, but the owner and the president are looking to the GM to give them honest assessments of what's going on with this football team.
Yep.
And he may be positive. Sorry, he may be positive.
That's why working with a company like Sumer Sports is so valuable, because people will say that analytics takes out the human element of the game, and that's true in some ways. But taking out the human element sometimes is a good thing, in the sense of, if you just want to say, like, look, I really like so and so. However, the numbers would suggest that he or she is not using or not, allocating resources properly, right? Like, that's the thing in our jobs, right? Where if the owner comes to you and they're like, what do you think of so and so? It's like, well, personally, I really like this person, but the numbers are not doing what they're supposed to do. And so, like, that to me is the best way to give an unbiased estimate of how it's going, without obviously, jeopardizing friendships and stuff. You're never going to perfectly do that, but I do think the analytics in that way helps, right? And it helps because you don't turn it into sort of this matchup between, like, am I going to keep my job if this person leaves, et cetera, et cetera.
Excellent discussion. I know we both have to go here soon.
Yep. Dan says, if you have a good process, eventually things work out. I tend to agree with that. Speaking of good process, please, for everybody, it was a slow day on the stream until the very end, but on Twitter, we had a decent amount of following here. Hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, tell everybody that how much you love this show. So when we hit big, you can be one of the, Thomas, we do have to come up with a name for our listeners at some point. Sumerians feels right, but maybe a little too easy. So let's think about that. Let's workshop that over the weekend so that we can give our great listeners, the Frasers, the Masses, the Seans, the Dans, everybody that comes in and makes the show what it is, we can give them a proper name for the show. So for Thomas Dimitroff, for Eric Eager, this has been the Sumer Sports Show.